Hello to all of my poodling arounders. How are you today? This episode is for any one of you who loves gardens and gardening, but also anyone who just likes finding out more about very different and exquisite places. Now, I'm not sure my own garden can really be described as one of those right now, but I'm blaming the weather for that. And in fairness, I do have sweet peas, courgettes, artichokes, and various other plants all lined up for planting. It's just I only ever seem to find time to cut the grass and pull a few weeds out before the rain clouds emerge. Somehow, I even managed to sustain an arm injury 2 weeks ago, and I've no idea how I did that. But despite the weather challenges, my next guest manages to keep the Levens Hall and Gardens garden looking tip-top no matter what the season. But what exactly is the attraction right now in the summer months? I spoke to head gardener Chris Crowder to find out. Chris, we talk a lot about the Guinness World Record holding topiary garden at Levens Hall and Gardens during May time when we're celebrating World Topiary Day, because after all, it is the world's oldest topiary garden. But as we come into June, July, and August, is it time to move slightly away from that and focus on other parts of the gardens?
Absolutely. I think although the topiary gets plenty of lines in print and pictures, it's a garden. So a topiary actually is only a small part of it. And it's the overall effect of the garden, I think, is the marvellous thing at Levens.
Yes, indeed. So could you tell us a little bit about parts of the garden that come into their own in the summer months?
Well, as for the rest of the garden, we've got a rose garden area. We've got many herbaceous borders, bee borders. There's a fountain garden, vegetable borders, herb garden. It's extensive. Lawns, trees, walls. It's got the lot.
And you mentioned the borders there, and there are two distinct colour themes for those, aren't there?
Yeah, certainly for the main borders that cut east-west across the garden. They're halved in the middle of each circle. There's an interval, and then they continue. So they're broad, grassy walks. They're double herbaceous borders, which means they're reflecting and repeating down either side of where you walk. And on one side, the pastel colours, so they're coming into their own now. The blues, the pinks, the yellows, that sort of thing. And then as you pop out the other side, there's reds and purples, a deeper, fierier colour scheme.
Hmm. And is it not also true to say that the borders form a fairly important role in giving structure to the garden, along with other features that were planned from the early days?
Absolutely. The main structure, the layout of the garden dates back to the 1690s, and we still work within that structure that was laid out then. So the east-west and the north-south axes, east and west, you go down herbaceous borders, and north and south, the garden's cut in half that way, and so quartering it all together. But the north-south one's the beech hedges. So
Hmm.
they're still there from that original layout.
And you mentioned the beech hedges, but they're pretty huge, aren't they?
They are. They've asked. They've been growing for centuries, so they are a very, very big and striking feature of the garden. They are, they're huge. We know that when we start clipping them because it takes us months to just do our beech
Yeah.
hedges. About 5 feet long, very tall, very, very wide, and is certainly a part of the garden. And actually, within, as you walk through and under the beech hedge through the archways, you see a lot of the structure. These old gnarled branches are fascinating as well.
Hmm. Is there anything new making its way into the borders this year? Because I know you like to experiment and bring new varieties of plant in each year.
Yes, well, we always try something a little new, and bits and pieces get mixed in, and nature takes its hand as well. It's not just us. We always plant 3 times more in the borders than is probably needed. I always say there's every 3 plants, one's for the rabbits, another one's for the slugs and snails, and the last one fills the space. And
Mm.
so nature helps us in the choice of planting ultimately, but it's fun, and it does change each year, the emphasis, and also what's good each year depends on the weather as well as the bugs eating the stuff. So it will be there will be new stuff, but I like my emphasis on the garden and the borders is really about the effect they create rather than the individual plants. It's the bigger effect that's seen. So
So it's all about the visuals for the visitors.
absolutely, yeah.
Mm. And moving on to the vegetables and the herbs, what can visitors find growing in those areas during the summer months?
Oh, well, we've just started to tackle those. Well, we've been tackling the asparagus, which has been very nice start to the season. And of course, the rhubarb and the rhubarb crumbles have been a good starter. But the vegetable borders do fill up. In that area garden, they're backed by a nuttery, hazelnuts, cobnuts, and filberts. But the borders themselves, we have around the central circle and the sundial, we have wigwams of sweet peas we've just planted out. And the other wigwams that line the walks, they've got scarlet runner beans in them, which look as good in flower as they do in production. So that's something to look forward to. And in between, plant all sorts of leafy vegetables. So it looks good throughout the season. We don't completely crop it at any one time. And we've got lots of courgettes and pumpkins and gourds and that sort of thing in there as well. So productive as well as beautiful.
Oh, well, you've given me a good hint there because I was thinking about getting some sweet peas out. So you've obviously given me the indication
The
this is the
time,
right
yes.
time.
The time to get a lot of things out. Yeah, there's hardly a moment for the next month or two.
Mm. Now, the orchard is an area that's probably lesser explored by visitors. What can be seen there during the summer?
Well, the orchard quarter of the garden, you might think is less explored, but actually, I think it's one of the more photographed and explored parts later on in the summer. But it's not so much for the fruit trees. We do have a lot of old fruit trees, medlars, damsons, of course, lots of apples through there, and they've just looked beautiful in blossom. There's been red tulips underneath every tree through there early on in the spring. And now, as it moves on to this sort of time of year, the main feature is the borders through there, which we've planted up for bees and pollinators and that sort of thing. Very fashionable and very good looking. We sow annual seeds. So at the moment, the borders are just greening over with about an inch height of growth, a few centimetres high. But as the season continues, that will get a lot bigger, up to knee height and above, with all sorts of flowers to delight the bees and the butterflies.
Oh, how lovely. And then we've got the fountain garden. I mean, that garden's celebrating an anniversary this year, isn't it? And I think that was an area that really was shaped in your time as head gardener. So can you describe that to us and how the vision for it came to life and what's delightful about it in summer?
Well, I suppose the current incarnation is it's 30 years since it was put in, but its original incarnation in Beaumont's time, back when the garden was laid out in the 1690s, that had been there for a long time, but it did disappear. The circle and four cross paths cutting across that quarter of the gardens disappeared in the 20s under hard tennis courts. There was a huge craze, really, at these country houses for all things tennis, and they had hard tennis courts there. And then after that, post-war, it was vegetable and cut flower production for market for a long time. But I've always had in mind putting something back, more of the original sort of circle and cross paths design. And 300 years ago, sorry, the 300th anniversary of the garden in 1694 to 1994, that was a good excuse for spending a bit of money, getting a digger in and digging a pool out, putting some pathways in, and lining the paths there. And so what we've got now is a circular pool with white water lilies covering most of the surface, with a fountain, central jet fountain in the centre. Then around the outside, we've got pleached limes and lime tunnels. That's not the tropical fruit, the linden tree, lime tree. So there's shady tunnels and pleached limes around the outside of the pool. And the splashing water slightly distracts the ear from some of the road noise or mower noise or all the other noises you get in a garden. And it's certainly a nice restful and contemplative place to be in the summer.
And there's some nice benches there, very helpfully placed, that you can just sit there and
Yes,
enjoy.
the visitors do. I never sit there, unfortunately. There's always too much to do, but the visitors certainly do enjoy sitting in those spots there.
And there's also now a croquet lawn, isn't there? But it was once a bowling green.
Well, I must correct you there. There's always been a bowling green, and
All right.
this bowling green, it's the Cheeky Croquet Club. Might like to call it a croquet green, but actually,
Oh, right. Okay. So people do still play bowls. Ah.
they play croquet on it. That's all it's used for now. But the emphasis is on it being a bowling green, because all these big houses would have had bowling greens. And bowls is the ancient game that went back centuries and centuries and centuries. Croquet, you might think it's an old-fashioned game, but it's actually quite newfangled compared with the game of bowls, which was the gambling gentleman's game of choice back in the day.
Well,
So we have,
Francis Drake and his Armada story. Yeah.
and for centuries before that, bowls was the thing. So we have one of the oldest bowling greens in the country, if not the oldest bowling green. And but currently the croquet club use it, and actually they look very appropriate. They all dress up in white and go out in all weathers and knock their croquet balls through hoops, and it's good. It's nice to see them. They're an entertainment and a decoration on that lawn. And best of all, when they approached us to say, could they use our bowling green? We said, yes, if you mow it. So it's a little bit of mowing that we've offloaded onto them.
Right. And do you have to keep it flat for them? Do you have to do some rolling there? Or?
Well, we do help with some of the other jobs that you needed with a good lawn, but the weekly, at least we've handed that off. But yes, we do try and keep it as flat as possible, and never flat enough for the croquet players. But yeah, yeah.
Well, that's half the skill, isn't it? So going uphill and bumps and.
Maybe a home team advantage. They know where the bumps and hollows are.
Now, roses also play a big part in the garden during the summer, don't they? What sort of varieties can visitors find there? And what's the role of the roses at Levens Hall and Gardens, as well as just looking and smelling pretty?
We have some roses, I suppose, scattered around the gardens. We've got in the herb garden, we've got the apothecary's rose, which is a nice scented medieval rose, really. And actually, rose petals used to be the herbal cure for everything. It was either that or being bled by leeches. So I'm sure you'd choose rose petal cure to begin with. That's the red rose of Lancaster, is its other name, and they're in the herb garden. Down the red purple borders, we've got Rosa rugosa, Rosary de la Haye, which makes huge, big shrub covered with really scented blooms, reddy purpley colour, magenta colour. But elsewhere in the garden, most of the roses you'll find in the rose garden, which is a part of the topiary garden. We've got topiary pieces amongst the roses. But that area we set about putting in David Austin's English roses. He bred roses and still breeds roses. And the English roses are a variety of... he wanted to get the scent back and the form of old-fashioned roses. And old-fashioned roses are great, but they only flower once in June, and that's it for no more roses in the summer. So what David Austin did, he did a lot of breeding work, and he got the scent and the colour and the form of the old-fashioned roses and bred them with repeat flowers. So now you've got these old-fashioned feel of roses and, most importantly, scent that flower on from midsummer, which is mostly when roses start. About now, actually, the first roses are blooming, and they flower right through to the autumn. So we've got lovely scented roses. Mixed roses in each bed. No labels amongst them. I'd rather people enjoy a garden and the plants within it for what it is and the effect it creates than spend their time distracted by labels. So, so they're all mixed up, and they are David Austin's English roses, which are very appropriate and lovely things. And what do they add to the garden? Well, basically, that scent and form. What more do you want from roses?
Yes, and they do look beautiful when they're out, don't they?
Yeah.
It adds a lot of colour and just vibrancy to it all.
Mm.
But the planting around the topiary changes seasonally, doesn't it? So, in which month do you switch from spring plants to summer bedding plants? And what varieties and colours will visitors see this summer?
Well, we've got, I don't know, we plant about 15,000 individual plants out amongst the topiary and flower beds there. And we do that twice a year. So there's plenty of opportunity to change it and evolve it down through the years and through the seasons. So at the moment, it's the tail end of the spring display that we're looking at. Not the tail end, the actual peak of the spring display. But already, and this is the time of year, end of May, beginning of June, where we need to move those plants out to move the new ones in for the rest of the summer. So it's happening about now. We'll be ripping out plants later today and getting new plants in, tomorrow, next week time. Once the last frost goes, that's the opportunity. And I don't think we'll probably get any more frost now. So we can empty our greenhouses out into the flower garden. Yes, it'll take us a month. We start now, but we'll still be doing it in a month's time. And then it's set for the summer display. And that will bring us right through to October, I suppose. So we've got salvias and heliotropes and antirrhinums and verbena, stuff like that. And it's purples, blues, whites, yellows, that sort of colour scheme. And I'm a keen beekeeper, so I make sure all these flowers are perfect for my bees as well.
Yes, indeed. So the bees are going to be really happy, aren't they?
Oh, I try and keep them that way, yes.
Yeah. So going back to the topiary, it's at its sharpest in April and May, isn't it? But it's still fabulous to look at during the summer, isn't it? And some of it becomes home to a red plant, doesn't it? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, we only get so many questions asked of us by the visitor, and we know the most popular questions at any time of the year. And once that red flower that flies up the topiary and flies up the hedges is in flower, that's the question we'll be asked. We know when people's approaching us. It's a lovely climber. It flies up the hedges in the summer. It has strings of or ribbons of scarlet flowers, followed by little turquoise berries. It's a relative of the nasturtiums. It's a thing called Tropiolum speciosum, and we know that name well because we repeat it so often to interested visitors. It looks superb against the dark yew hedges. It does grow in other conditions. The Scottish flame flower is an easier one for people to remember, or the Chilean flame creeper. It actually is originally from Chile, but grows well in the cool, damp climate of Scotland. So we do cool and damp summers relatively well here. So it's okay here. But further south in the country, the drier and the further east you get, the drier it gets usually. And so it doesn't succeed as well in the southeast as it does in the northwest of the UK. But it's a fantastic plant.
Well, I really like the Latin name because it sounds like Harry Potter, doesn't it? So, like one of the spells.
Speciosum, yes.
Yeah.
Not a spell, but yeah, not to cast a spell, maybe.
Mm. So, just so visitors are aware, they won't see you clipping any topiary in the summer months, will they? But come the start of September, that's an attraction in itself, isn't it?
Yes, we like 6 months off, like anybody would for good behaviour, and we let the topiary grow in the summer. The hedges grow. We're too busy with other garden jobs. But most importantly, if we clip any of the stuff early, if we had the time, we might, and we might trim the odd sharp edge. But really, it grows again. So, and we'd never have time to do everything twice. So we do everything once, and we start on the 1st of September because we know if we clip then, it's heading to autumn. The plants won't put on another growth spurt then. They'll stay clipped right through till the following summer. Yes, so no clipping, but yes, when we do start clipping, it is an entertainment. We're still open to the public, and they'll see us on some very big cherry pickers, hydraulic lifts, teetering about right at the top, trying to get these shapes sharpened up, top down, ready for the next season. And it takes a couple of months to work our way through all the topiary, even before we start the hedges. So there's plenty to see there.
Now, if visitors want to just have some quiet time and sit and relax for a while in the gardens, where would you suggest is the best place to be?
Well, there are plenty of benches around the gardens, and they just have to find their ideal spot. I think probably the nicest one is around the pool with the fountain. The splashing of the water of the fountain sort of distracts the ear from road noise and the world outside. And yes, it'd be very soporific. I'm sure if I sat down there for any length of time, I'd be fast asleep. But that's me.
Well, we can't have that, Chris. I think we've got far too much to do.
Absolutely, always.
Yeah. Now, there's an unusual feature called a ha-ha, isn't there? Can you tell us about the one at Levens Hall and what role it performed there?
We have the first ha-ha in England, reputedly. So a ha-ha is basically it's a wall sunk down in the ditch. That doesn't sound very romantically described, but let me describe the situation in the 1690s before the ha-ha was introduced. All gardens had to be surrounded by a wall or a hedge or a fence or something to keep the animals and the locals out. So gardens were very inward-looking. They didn't look out to the landscape. And then somebody had the brainwave or introduced it from France. The garden's designer here, in this case, was a Frenchman. And he brought this idea of just digging a shallow trough or a hollow or a ditch or something like that and putting a retaining wall within it. So as you walk out from the garden, there is no barrier between you and the landscape beyond. And here at Levens, the landscape's rather nice. That ha-ha, the main vista through the garden, doesn't finish in a fence or a wall, and that's it. There's a ha-ha, so it's the view is uninterrupted. It just seems like you could walk off into the field. When you get closer, you get to see the ditch, but and the drop. But it seems like you could walk off into the field, and the view of the distant hills, in our case, White Scar, a huge white limestone cliff about a mile or two away, It's at the end of that vista. So it was a big thing. It was introducing the landscape into the garden and borrowing the outer landscape for the garden. And it became very fashionable, really, in the 1700s when Capability Brown and the like were upping the natural landscape. But the one at Levens works as well today as it ever did. It keeps the animals out and lets you see the view out, and it was the first.
Now, whilst some visitors may have only focused on the topiary garden and not bothered too much about seeing the rest of the gardens because they simply want to bag the world's oldest, there's something to encourage them to explore more this year, isn't there, in the form of artworks?
Well, I don't know whether we have actually yet topiary baggers and nothing more, but we do have some artworks around the garden this year. Bob Sutcliffe, a local artist and charity fundraiser, more to the point, and that's what it's all about. He's put some canvases out in the garden for people to look at and contemplate the words alongside them. And it's great. Currently, they're scattered around in the topiary garden. It's good. I like it as an extra dimension to the garden. Any of these artistic endeavours that are there as, say, a temporary seasonal feature are great. Sometimes you look at a piece of artwork, and if it's a permanent feature in a garden, you think they either you like them or you don't, particularly with more modern artwork. But with anything there for the season, that it's a wonderful thing, because whether you like it or not, it won't be there the next year. I personally, I really like these canvases. They're traditional watercolour paintings, but made bigger for display in the garden. And some of them are of local woodlands, trees, scenes like that. And some of them are actually of the garden and the trees within it. And they're great. If I had the time, I'd paint myself. And it's one of the most interesting things, actually, seeing the visitors in the garden. Some will bring their paintbrushes and easels and try and capture the garden in their way. And I always like to look over the shoulders and compare notes. That's something that I really think adds to the garden experience.
Yeah, and what sort of responses have you had from visitors so far?
I think the visitors rather like them. They are traditional paintings, which are easier to understand than some perhaps more modern interpretation of stuff. And they give that extra dimension, make people look at things in a different way, which is the point of the art. And they're also a nice thing to search out around the garden. Currently, they're in the topiary garden, but we'll be moving them about, and Bob's going to bring in some new ones as the season progresses. And they are a nice thing to spot and see and look at on the way around. Yeah, the visitors like them.
And are the easels standing up to this terrible weather that we're currently enjoying here?
They are. The easels are heavy-duty easels. They're not ones that you actually use for painting on. They're more display items, and they've got a chain and a very large piece of Lakeland slate swinging from them to hold them down in the gales. Certainly, the weather has been bad this last day or so. A lot of rain, and we've had a bit of wet weather recently. We've had nice weather up till the last few days, but the easels have stood up to it and will withstand the test of the season, I'm sure.
Good. Good to hear that. And it's not just art this year that's taking part in the garden, is it? There's other events that are scheduled to come along in the calendar. Can you tell us about some of those?
Oh, now then, what have we got? We sometimes have musicians playing in the gardens, and doubtless we'll be having some of those. Check the website for further details, because that's what I've not done, so I can't give you huge details on that. But we do have people out in the gardens performing music. And the other thing we've got, there's a theatre group coming in the summer, and they'll be performing one of Shakespeare's plays, I think, on the front lawns, and that'll be an entertainment, an outdoor production. The Handlebars, they call themselves, and they bring their entire staging on bicycles, I believe. Anyway, that'll be an entertainment come the summer.
Well, just seeing everything on the bicycle, that'll be entertainment itself, won't it? So, what sort of jobs will visitors see you and your team doing during the summer months? And can they ask questions if they spot any of you?
Oh, we're always up for a distraction, of course. Yes, if it's a good excuse to stand up and stretch our backs for a moment, we love talking to the visitors, and they're usually complimentary. And as I say, we've learned what plants they'll ask by the season, and we know the answers before they ask them almost. But as for our work, once we get the big plant changeover and we empty the greenhouses out to the gardens over the next month or so, Mainly in the summer, the creative work, if you like, is done, or this season is in place, or we then maintain the garden. So it's the usual edging, weeding, mowing, and just keeping it looking as top good as we possibly can, day by day and week by week. So that's our work till September the 1st, when it all changes. The new year, I always think in my mind, starts on September the 1st, and when we start the clipping season for the following year. And that's also when we start sowing a lot of the seeds for the following spring and taking the cuttings. So September the 1st is my new year.
Yes. Not a Chinese New Year, but Chris's New Year. So I know that you'd love to see bees in the gardens, and you've got your own hives there and head gardener's honey, haven't you? But what about children buzzing around? Is it good to try and inspire the younger generation to come along and get some fresh air in their lungs and learn about nature?
Absolutely. We always like to see well-behaved children looking at the garden. Yeah, it isn't the garden itself, though, isn't a play park type of garden. It's not, and it's not a parkland landscape. It's actually a very detailed and manicured historic site. So we appreciate when there's a little bit of respect given. But yeah, children are welcome. We do see children through the garden and school groups. I think there's another one coming next week, and they take it in, and sometimes they look at the shapes and give us new ideas of what some of the shapes are, and yeah, have a great time in the garden. But yes, well-behaved ones, please. Better behaved parents, if possible. That'd be great.
And there is a playground area for the children as well, isn't there, if they want to let off steam?
Absolutely. That's the place to run to, is the adventure playground at the bottom of the garden.
Yeah. Now, with all the hard work that you do there, I would hope that you get treated to some of the delights from Levens Kitchen and Levens Bakery. What's your favourite treat from either of those to tuck into during a hard day's work?
Oh, I don't know. We never get anything from the bakery very much, or the restaurant. So, yeah. The usual thing is we have some kind volunteers work in the garden, and not only do they volunteer to help us out with the weeding and the general garden maintenance, but our volunteers voluntarily bake cakes for us and biscuits. So that's our usual source of sustenance.
Oh, well, that sounds good. Yes. How kind of them.
Mm.
So, yeah, I'm imagining all sorts of lovely baked apple pies now, and fruit pies of all varieties and things like that. Um, so finally, we've just produced a new topiary tourism guide that helps people explore not just Levens Hall and Gardens garden, if you're on holiday or on a day out, but also 34 gardens across Europe and the USA that are home to topiary. You've been at Levens Hall for a very long time now, so would you say that this is reflective of a growing love of topiary across the world?
I think topiary's been in and out of fashion for, and always been there in the background for centuries. In fact, millennia. The original references to topiary, like from thousands of years ago, the topiarius back in ancient Rome was the original garden slave, and so that we feel a bit like that when we're working away at the topiary every year. And it has been in and out of fashion. In the 1690s, when Levens was laid out, it was a huge craze for it. And then it was out of fashion in the 1700s. And it's been a bit on and a bit off ever since. And it's pleasing that people still have the interest. And people appreciate it, I think. It's good for publicity because it's very visual, so it can end up in print anywhere or on the screen for its visual attributes. But I think people appreciate the gardens because it's a relatively rare thing to have at scale, because it's so labor intensive. It's not just difficult or time consuming to do. It's also that sense of you need time to create a suitable garden. So all these things conspire to make it a rarity and something worth hunting out. And of course, at Levens, we've got a lot of it. It's been here a long time, and it is quite spectacular. So is it more popular? I don't know. It's always popular with the discerning and the interested, I think, yes.
Yes.
And for everybody else, it's just a mind-blowingly amazing thing to come across when you go into a garden.
Yeah, I think particularly at Levens, it is very different because, having done the topiary tourism guide and looked at some of the French gardens and their photography, it is quite different there, I think. There's a lot of emphasis on parterre in France, isn't there, rather than the sculpted pieces, perhaps, that you've got.
Yes, and some gardens, the very grandest gardens, like in France or Italy, you can stand at one point, and that's what they were designed for. You stand at the steps of the house or the top floor of the house, and you can look down and see everything all at once. Whereas a garden like Levens is far more intimate. And big gardens, sometimes every piece is the same. It's a cone or whatever, or something very formal. Whereas at Levens, every turn's a different piece. Every piece is an individual and has its own character. So it's a different scale, a different type of thing altogether. And you think, well, topiary or some sort of form like that would everything would be the same. Every garden around the world would be the same. But actually, because it's that artistry and the nature coming together and vying with each other for control and the direction a plant goes, every garden's unique and an individual expression of time, history, and art.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. That's been a great explanation of what we can see in this summer, well, every summer at Levens Hall and Gardens. What's your next task now?
I'm going to go out there and go to the greenhouses and start moving plants from inside to outside, and for the first part of their journey into the garden. That'll be next week. We'll be hardening them off in the meantime. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, Chris.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Now then, you heard Chris Crowder there, and I hope that you found that really interesting. But did you know that he's the 11th gardener that Levens Hall and Gardens has had since 1694? Now, that's not that many in 330 years, if you do the maths. So, who were the others? Well, they were all men, I do have to say. And as part of my PR work, I last year focused on these other 11. So here's a quick rundown for you. The first, as you heard Chris mention, was a Frenchman, Monsieur Guillaume Beaumont. For several years now, we've been appealing for information about this very elusive man. A portrait inside Levens Hall suggests that he laid out the gardens at Hampton Court Palace, as well as Levens, and that he was gardener to King James II. But we know he was not the head gardener at Hampton Court. He may also have worked at Versailles under André Le Notre, but again, we're not entirely sure. In 1689, he was working for Colonel Graham, or Graham, the owner of Levens Hall and Gardens, for £10 a year, working at Graham's estate at Bagshot in the south. He arrived at Levens on the 1st of November 1694. Intense work then began cutting out walks, levelling the ground, quartering the garden, and creating the circular enclosure and the beech circle that we can see today. He ordered vast amounts of seeds, peas, carrots, leeks, cauliflower, radishes, you name it, and borders were created and trees planted. The ha-ha that Chris mentioned was also built. Beaumont lived in the cottage in the garden, in which Chris lives today, and in which all head gardeners have lived since Beaumont. This was built specifically for Beaumont. In 1701, a violent storm saw the loss of some of the trees in Levens Park, just across the way from the hall, and Beaumont, or Beaumont if you prefer, planted new, stronger trees there. In 1703, he was levelling out and laying the bowling green, and in 1708, the Great Oak Avenue along the carriage drive. By 1723, the records tell us that Beaumont was in very ill health, and that continued until his death in 1727. At that point, his assistant, Thomas Tyson, then became the head gardener. He had a mixed time, always being suspected of profiting from the private sale of fruit and vegetables. The orange trees, which were pretty precious to the owner of the time, were neglected too. In 1758, his time seemed to run out, and his laziness seemed to lead to his sacking. In stepped Archibald Macmillan, who had worked for Tyson for 20 years, and who was the head gardener from 1758 until 1810. By 1759, he had made the gardens, and I quote, look very gay. Fruit was in abundance. The gardens, however, were now viewed as, and I quote, old style and too formal. Tastes had completely changed. But luckily, Levens Gardens survived in their formal state, including the topiary garden, with the female owners of Levens Hall often living at their husbands' properties elsewhere and not spending any money on Levens, and actually rather liking the romanticism of the old-fashioned garden. In 1810, it was the turn of Alexander Forbes to step in, and he filled the role of head gardener for 51 years. New box trees were planted by a man who authored a book called Short Hints on Ornamental Gardens. Forbes seemed to do a good job. There was a Hugh Bower noted in his time, which is today's judge's wig. By 1834, topiary was back in fashion, and the, and I quote, extremely amusing figures of the Levens topiary garden were appreciated once again. Robert Craig served from 1861 to 1883 as head gardener, and the first photo of the garden dates from his time. By now, herbaceous plants and roses could be seen, and Craig seemed to embrace the Victorian craze for ferns as well. Craig was succeeded by Alexander Milne in 1883. Now, we know very little about him, but in 1895 we do know that he was succeeded by the man who'd been his foreman, William Gibson, who worked right through World War I. This was a time when the golden yews that you can see in the topiary garden today would have been planted, along with a ginkgo tree, which was also in the topiary garden. In 1904, Gibson published a book called The Book of Topiary. Gertrude Jekyll visited and determined that there was nothing childish about the Levens garden, an accusation that had been levelled at it. In fact, she said, would that all gardens were childish in so happy a way. Gibson's son, luckily for us, made an audio recording in which he described how 10 men worked with his father, starting at 6 a.m. and ending at 5:30 p.m. They sold produce that was produced there in London, and lawns were mowed by Jessie the horse, fitted with leather shoes and pulling a lawn mower that was too heavy for the men to manipulate. By now, the public were being allowed into the Levens Hall garden, on Thursdays only, however. It was so popular that 200 to 300 people would arrive by horse-drawn charabanc for a personal tour provided by Gibson. Unfortunately, the team was split up by World War I, with only one of the younger members of Gibson's team returning from the fighting. In 1919, F.C. King took over. By this point, the tennis courts that Chris mentioned had been laid out on the bowling green, and a hard court now overlaid Beaumont's original quartered design. The topiary gardens had been extended, but Beaumont's wilderness had been turned into an Italian water garden. In the late 1920s, 2 intrepid Americans, known as the Bicycle Boys, arrived on a tour of Britain by bicycle, with the aim of visiting over 80 UK gardens in just 3 months. These Massachusetts cyclists had found their way to Levens Hall and Gardens, but did so on a Saturday, when Mr. King was out. I think he was playing cricket. They could only get a quick peek of the garden provided by Mr. King's wife. Queen Mary, who arrived in 1937, did get a tour, however, and that was just before another very difficult time, the Second World War period. Luckily, soldiers were not billeted at Levens Hall and Gardens, which instead welcomed evacuated nuns. That again probably helped the gardens survive. Despite this, however, all available ground had to be given over to food production for the wartime effort. We do know, however, that the topiary garden was clipped, even though the beech hedge really suffered. Mr. King was an enthusiast for organic principles and way ahead of his time. Luckily, after the Second World War had finished, he was able to take on some much-needed renovation. The pools were filled in, and box hedge was renewed. At that point, much effort was given to income generation from market gardening. A 1950 photo shows the gardeners clipping the great umbrella tree using a generator and the first electric hedge clippers. What they did before that, we can only presume, was by ladder. In 1954, Mr. King moved on, and between 1954 and 1980, Mr. Robertson was the head gardener, and he established a hardy plant nursery. By now, the gardens were welcoming visitors 5 days a week. A major fight during this time revolved around plans to actually take over part of Levens Park and turn it into the M6 motorway. Thankfully, thanks to lobbying from the Bagot family who owned Levens Hall and Gardens, Beaumont's work in the park was saved. The head gardener's role then passed to Mr. Robertson's son for 6 years before Chris took over in 1986. Chris's book, called The Garden at Levens, was published in 2005 and is a beautiful read if you can get hold of a copy. Chris's topiary passion has been for tiered topiary trees, of which you will find various examples now in the garden. As you heard, Chris also oversaw the 300th anniversary celebrations and the establishment of the fountain garden in Beaumont's quartered area that had become a tennis court and then a food production area. During 2005, Chris also witnessed the loss of a massive cedar tree, which was originally planted by Macmillan back in 1780. Chris has revitalised the rose garden, removed invasive species from the herb garden, and also introduced quinces, medlars and damsons to the orchard. In the early 1990s, he also gave the bowling green a great overhaul and rebirth. So there we have it, 330 years of history and a garden shaped by 11 men and their teams. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and a quick journey into the past. Until the next time, whether you are walking the hills and the parks around Malibu, or cycling around the natural feature of Morecambe Bay, or enjoying a picnic in the English Garden in Munich, somewhere I've recently written a blog about, take really good care of yourself, remembering that life's much more fun when you are poodling around.